Dr. Jennifer Walsh froze mid-examination, her latex glove suspended inches from the massive, angry red bulge protruding from Robert Mitchell's neck like a grotesque second head. The thing wasn't just large, it was moving. "Sweet Mother of God," whispered Nurse Rodriguez, her clipboard clattering to the sterile hospital floor as she stumbled backward into the supply cart, sending gauze and syringes scattering across the linoleum. Michael Mitchell stood in the doorway, his insurance adjuster's composure crumbling as he stared at his 72-year-old father lying unconscious on the gurney. 3 years. 3 years since Mom died, and he'd never noticed, never even looked, at what his father had been hiding beneath those wool scarves and baseball caps, even in Ohio's sweltering summers. "Get me an ultrasound team, now!" Dr. Walsh's voice cracked with an urgency she'd never felt in 15 years of emergency medicine. What had been growing inside Robert Mitchell's neck? And how long did they have before it killed him? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Robert Eugene Mitchell had always been a man of routines, and at 72, those routines had become his lifeline to sanity. Every morning at 5:30 sharp, he'd shuffle from his narrow bed in the cramped apartment above Murphy's hardware store, his arthritic joints protesting against the Ohio winter that seemed to live in his bones year-round. The apartment wasn't much. A single room with a kitchenette, a bathroom barely wide enough to turn around in, and windows that looked out onto Millfield's dying Main Street. But it was what he could afford on $800 a month in Social Security. The baseball cap went on first, always. Then the wool scarf, even when the August heat made him dizzy. Mrs. Henderson from across the street had stopped asking why he dressed like it was December in July. Most folks in Millfield had learned not to question the habits of a widower, especially one who'd taught half the town's children algebra for 37 years. Robert's reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror told a story he wasn't ready to share. Beneath the Cleveland Indians cap that Margaret had bought him for his 60th birthday, beneath the hand-knitted scarf she'd finished just weeks before the cancer took her voice, was a secret that had been growing for 2.5 years. What started as a small bump, something he'd dismissed as an ingrown hair or maybe a swollen gland, had become a grotesque bulge the size of a softball, angry red and tender to the touch. "Don't be a burden, Robbie," he'd whisper to Margaret's photograph every morning, the same promise he'd made at her funeral. "Don't you worry about this old fool." His son Michael lived 200 miles away in Columbus, busy with his insurance job, his wife Sarah, and those twin granddaughters Robert barely knew. Emma and Sophie, 16 now and probably too cool to care about a grandfather who smelled like menthol rub and talked too much about the good old days. Michael called every few weeks, dutiful but distant, their conversations filled with weather reports and awkward silences. The truth was, Robert had sold everything of value to pay for Margaret's medical bills. The house on Elm Street where they'd raised Michael, where Margaret had tended her prize-winning roses, where 43 years of marriage had unfolded, all of it sacrificed to keep her comfortable in those final months. The wedding ring that had never left her finger, her mother's china, even the 1967 Chevelle he'd restored in their garage. Everything had a price, and everything had been paid. Now, feeding Einstein the stray tabby who'd adopted him, Robert felt the familiar sharp pain shoot through his neck and down his spine. The mass had been bleeding more lately, seeping through the bandages he changed twice daily. He knew what Margaret would have said. "Robert Eugene Mitchell, you get yourself to a doctor this instant." But Margaret wasn't here to scold him, and doctors cost money he didn't have. Money that Michael and his family needed for the girls' college funds, not for keeping a stubborn old man alive. The morning of October 15th started like any other for Robert Mitchell. At exactly 5:30, his internal clock pulled him from restless sleep, his neck throbbing with the familiar pain that had become his constant companion. He reached for the Indian's cap on his nightstand, wincing as the movement sent fire shooting down his spine. The scarf came next, Margaret's final gift, soft blue wool that still carried the faintest trace of her lavender perfume after 3 years. Outside his window, Millfield was waking up. Murphy's Hardware would open in 2 hours, and the familiar sounds of small-town morning, delivery trucks rumbling past, the coffee shop's bell jingling as early customers arrived, provided a soundtrack to his solitary routine. Robert shuffled to his tiny kitchenette and measured out coffee grounds with the precision of a man who'd taught mathematics for nearly 4 decades. 1 scoop, 2 scoops. Never 3. Because 3 made his hands shake, and shaking hands meant spilled coffee, and spilled coffee meant questions about why a grown man couldn't perform simple tasks anymore. The pain was worse today, much worse. As he reached for Einstein's food bowl, a white-hot spike of agony shot through the base of his skull, and suddenly the small apartment was tilting sideways. The bowl clattered to the linoleum floor, scattering dry cat food like tiny brown pebbles across his feet. "Easy there, boy," Robert muttered to himself, gripping the counter until his knuckles went white. But his legs had turned to water, and the edges of his vision were going dark. The last thing he saw before consciousness abandoned him was Einstein's amber eyes watching from the windowsill, and the last thing he thought was that Margaret would be furious with him for making such a mess. Mrs. Henderson found him 20 minutes later, sprawled across his kitchen floor in a pool of coffee and blood. At 78, Dorothy Henderson had seen plenty of life's cruelties, but nothing had prepared her for the sight of her neighbor's neck. What had been hidden beneath scarves and high collars was now exposed in the fall, a massive, angry red bulge that looked like something from a medical textbook's worst-case scenarios. "Sweet Jesus, Robert," she whispered, her arthritic fingers fumbling for her cell phone. "What in God's name is that thing on your neck?" The ambulance arrived in 6 minutes. Millfield's volunteer EMT crew responding with the urgency reserved for their own neighbors. Frank Rodriguez, who'd delivered half the babies in town over 15 years of service, took one look at Robert's neck and felt his stomach lurch. "I've never seen anything like this," he told his partner Maria Santos, as they loaded Robert onto the stretcher. The mass was enormous, easily the size of a softball, with angry red streaks radiating outward like lightning bolts across Robert's pale skin. Worse, there were areas where the skin had broken open, weeping a mixture of blood and something else, something that made both EMTs exchange worried glances. "Call ahead to Cleveland Medical," Frank said as they pulled away from Murphy's Hardware, sirens wailing. "Tell them we're bringing in something they're going to want to see." Robert drifted in and out of consciousness during the 40-minute ride, mumbling incoherently about Margaret, about not wanting to be a burden, about someone named Michael who shouldn't be bothered. When he was lucid, his first words were always the same. "Don't call my son. Please don't call Michael." But hospital protocol was hospital protocol, and Michael Mitchell's phone rang at 9:47 a.m. while he was reviewing a water damage claim in his Columbus office. The voice on the other end was professional but urgent. His father had been brought to Cleveland Medical Center's emergency department with what they were calling a significant medical emergency. "What kind of emergency?" Michael asked, already reaching for his car keys. The insurance adjuster in him always wanted specifics, details, concrete information he could process and file away. "Sir, I think it would be best if you came in person. We're located on—" "I know where you are," Michael said, his mouth going dry. Is my father going to be okay?" There was a pause that lasted forever. "Sir, I really think you should come in person." The drive from Columbus to Cleveland normally took Michael 2.5 hours, but he made it in 1 hour and 53 minutes. His Honda Accord pushed to speeds that would have made his insurance company cringe. He called his wife Sarah 3 times during the trip, each conversation dissolving into the same helpless repetition. "I don't know what's wrong. I don't know anything. They won't tell me anything over the phone." When Michael finally burst through the emergency department doors at 11:40 a.m., he was completely unprepared for what waited for him in room 314. Nothing, not his father's recent quietness, not the scarves worn in summer heat, not the baseball caps that never came off, had prepared him for the monstrous growth that had been secretly consuming his father's neck for over 2 years. Dr. Jennifer Walsh had seen thousands of cases in her 15 years as Cleveland Medical Center's chief dermatologist, but nothing had prepared her for what lay beneath Robert Mitchell's bandages. The mass wasn't just large, it was anatomically impossible. Sebaceous cysts didn't grow to this size without rupturing. Lipomas didn't develop the angry, inflamed characteristics she was observing, and normal human tissue certainly didn't exhibit the strange, almost rhythmic movement she could see beneath the stretched, discolored skin. "Mr. Mitchell," she said gently, pulling up a chair beside his hospital bed. Robert's eyes were alert now, clearer than they'd been since his arrival 6 hours earlier. "I need you to understand that what you're dealing with is beyond anything we see in standard medical practice. This isn't something you could have treated at home with over-the-counter medications." Robert's weathered hands fidgeted with the hospital blanket. At 72, he'd always prided himself on being direct, on facing problems head-on like he'd taught his students to approach difficult equations. But shame had a way of making even the strongest men weak. "I know what you're thinking, Doc," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stupid old man should have come in sooner. Should have known better." "That's not what I'm thinking at all," Dr. Walsh replied. "What I'm thinking is that you've been carrying this burden alone for far too long." The door burst open without a knock, and Michael Mitchell stood in the doorway like a man who'd seen a ghost. His usually neat insurance adjuster appearance was disheveled, tie askew, shirt wrinkled from the frantic drive, eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and shock. For a long moment, father and son simply stared at each other across the sterile hospital room. "Dad," Michael said, and his voice cracked on that single syllable. "Oh my God, Dad." "Why didn't you tell me?" Robert turned away, unable to meet his son's eyes. "What was I supposed to say, Michael? Call you up in Columbus and tell you your old man's got some kind of monster growing out of his neck? You've got your own life, your own family. Sarah and the girls don't need to hear about this." "Don't need to hear about this?" Michael's voice rose, drawing a concerned glance from Dr. Walsh. "Dad, you could have died. You could have died alone in that apartment, and I would never have known. I would never have had the chance to—" He stopped, choking on words he'd never been good at saying. "The chance to what?" Robert asked, finally looking at his son. "The chance to watch your old man fall apart? The chance to worry about medical bills you can't afford? I've seen what this kind of thing costs, Michael. I lived through it with your mother." Dr. Walsh cleared her throat diplomatically. "Perhaps I should explain what we're dealing with medically, and then you can both process the emotional aspects. Mr. Mitchell, your condition is what we call a giant sebaceous cyst, but it's complicated by several factors that make it unlike anything I've encountered in my career." Michael pulled up a chair, his hands trembling slightly. "What kind of complications?" "The size, for one thing. Most sebaceous cysts that reach this magnitude rupture and drain naturally. Your father's has somehow maintained its structural integrity while continuing to grow. We're also seeing unusual vascularization, blood vessel development, throughout the mass. It's almost as if the cyst has developed its own circulatory system." Robert listened to the clinical description of his secret shame, remembering the night 2.5 years ago when he'd first noticed the small bump. Margaret had been dead for 6 months, and he'd been sitting in their bedroom, his bedroom now, feeling the weight of loneliness like a physical thing pressing down on his chest. The bump had been tiny then, barely noticeable, easy to ignore. "There's something else," Robert said quietly, interrupting Dr. Walsh's explanation. Both she and Michael turned to look at him. "Something I haven't told anyone." Michael leaned forward. "What, Dad?" "I haven't just been hiding this from you, son. I've been hiding from myself, too." Robert's voice grew stronger, the math teacher in him organizing his thoughts like a complex proof. "After your mother died, I sold the house to pay off her medical bills. All of them. Every last cent we owed to doctors, hospitals, specialists. The house, the car, her jewelry, even that old Chevelle I'd been restoring in the garage." Michael's face went white. "Dad, you didn't have to." "Yes, I did," Robert said firmly. "I made a promise to your mother that she'd never leave this world with debt hanging over our family, but it left me with nothing, Michael, nothing but $800 a month in Social Security and too much pride to ask for help." Dr. Walsh watched the exchange with growing understanding. She'd seen this before, elderly patients who chose suffering over what they perceived as burdening their families. But she'd never seen it taken to such an extreme. "Mr. Mitchell," she said gently, "are you telling us that you've been living in poverty for the past 3 years?" Robert nodded, unable to look at his son. "That apartment above Murphy's Hardware costs me $400 a month. After food and utilities, there's maybe $50 left over. I couldn't afford to see a doctor, couldn't afford tests or treatments, couldn't afford to be sick." Michael's chair scraped against the floor as he stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, Cleveland stretched away in all directions, full of people going about their normal lives, people who weren't discovering that their father had been suffering alone for years. "Dad," Michael said without turning around, "when's the last time I called you just to talk? When's the last time I visited without it being a holiday or a birthday?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Dr. Walsh stood, sensing that the family needed time to process this revelation. "I'll give you both some time to talk. But Mr. Mitchell, I need you to know, we're going to take care of this. All of it. The medical team here is very interested in your case, and there may be research opportunities that could help cover costs." After she left, father and son sat in the gathering dusk, both staring out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the distance. The next 72 hours transformed Cleveland Medical Center's dermatology wing into something resembling a detective story. Dr. Walsh had assembled what she privately called her dream team, specialists who normally worked in different departments, different hospitals, sometimes different states. The case of Robert Mitchell's massive cervical cyst had become the kind of medical puzzle that careers were built on. Tuesday morning brought the first wave of visitors to Robert's room. Sarah Mitchell arrived with 16-year-old twins Emma and Sophie, their faces a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed horror. Michael had tried to prepare them during the drive from Columbus, but nothing could have readied them for seeing their grandfather diminished by illness and connected to machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical concern. "Grandpa?" Sophie whispered, the braver of the twins by exactly 4 minutes. "Does it hurt?" Robert managed to smile, though the effort clearly cost him. "Not as much as watching you girls worry about your old grandpa. Come here and tell me about school. Tell me about boys. Tell me about anything except this ugly old thing on my neck." Emma, typically more reserved, hung back near the door until Robert patted the bed beside him. "I'm not contagious, sweetheart. Just old and stubborn, and your grandmother always said those weren't catching conditions." As the family settled into an awkward rhythm of hospital visits and hushed conversations, Dr. Walsh was 3 floors down in the radiology department, staring at ultrasound images that defied every textbook she'd ever studied. The mass showed complex internal structures, chambers and passages that seemed almost architectural in their organization. More puzzling still, Doppler ultrasound revealed active blood flow throughout the formation, as if Robert's body had somehow incorporated this growth into its circulatory system. "It's like nothing I've ever seen," Dr. Patricia Kim, the hospital's head pathologist, said as they reviewed the images together. "The tissue samples we took yesterday show normal sebaceous material, but there are also cellular structures I can't identify. Not malignant, not infectious, just different." Meanwhile, word of the case had begun to spread through Cleveland's medical community. By Wednesday afternoon, Dr. Walsh found herself fielding calls from researchers at Case Western, from specialists at the Mayo Clinic, and from a particularly persistent epidemiologist at the Centers for Disease Control who wanted to know if they'd considered the possibility of a new type of parasitic infection. "It's not parasitic," Dr. Walsh insisted during her third call with the CDC. "We've run every test imaginable. This appears to be the patient's own tissue, just organized in a way that shouldn't be possible." Back in room 314, Robert was discovering that being a medical curiosity brought unexpected visitors. Mrs. Henderson had driven up from Millfield with a casserole and enough gossip to fill an afternoon. Murphy, from the hardware store, brought Einstein the cat in a borrowed carrier, ignoring 3 different nurses who tried to explain hospital pet policies. "Figured you'd want to see your friend," Murphy said, setting the carrier on Robert's bedside table. "Store's not the same without you feeding the strays every morning." More surprising were the former students who somehow learned of his hospitalization. Jenny Rodriguez, now a certified public accountant in Akron, showed up Tuesday evening with flowers and a story about how Robert's patients had saved her from failing algebra 23 years ago. Tom Bradley, who'd gone on to become an engineer, drove in from Pittsburgh with his teenage daughter, wanting her to meet the teacher who'd convinced him that math could be beautiful. "Mr. Mitchell," Tom said, his daughter hanging shyly behind him, "I never properly thanked you. You changed my life in 10th grade when you showed me that equations were just puzzles waiting to be solved." Robert found himself overwhelmed by the attention. For 3 years since Margaret's death, he'd convinced himself that he was just a forgotten old man, that his contributions to the world had ended with his retirement. Now his small hospital room was filled with flowers, cards, and evidence that his life had mattered to more people than he'd ever imagined. But the medical mystery deepened with each passing day. Wednesday's MRI revealed that the mass extended deeper into Robert's neck than anyone had realized, with tendrils of unusual tissue wrapping around major blood vessels and nerves. What should have been a straightforward surgical removal had become a complex procedure requiring input from vascular surgeons, neurologists, and plastic surgeons. "The thing is," Dr. Walsh explained to the assembled family Wednesday evening, "we're not just dealing with a large cyst anymore. This growth has become integrated with your father's anatomy in ways that make removal extremely complicated." Michael, who'd taken leave from his insurance job to stay near the hospital, looked exhausted. "What are you saying exactly?" "I'm saying that surgery carries significant risks. There's a possibility of nerve damage, vascular complications, even stroke if we're not extremely careful. But leaving it untreated carries risks too. The mass is showing signs of increased pressure, and there's evidence of infection beginning to develop." Sarah, ever practical, asked the question that had been haunting all of them. "What's this going to cost?" Dr. Walsh hesitated. "With the surgical team we'll need, the specialized equipment, the extended hospital stay for recovery, we're looking at somewhere between $100,000 and $150,000. The silence that followed was broken by Robert's bitter laugh. "Well, that settles it then. I appreciate everything you've all done, but I can't put my family in debt for the rest of their lives. I'm 72 years old. I've had a good run." "Dad, don't you dare," Michael said, his voice shaking with anger and desperation. "Don't you dare give up." "Give up?" Robert struggled to sit up straighter in his hospital bed. "Son, I'm being realistic. You've got 2 daughters heading to college in 2 years. Sarah's got her own health issues she thinks nobody notices. You can't mortgage your family's future for a stubborn old man who should have dealt with this years ago." Emma, who'd been quietly listening from her chair by the window, suddenly spoke up. "Grandpa, you helped pay for Mom's cancer treatment when I was little, didn't you?" The adults turned to look at her, surprised by the question. Sarah's face went pale. "Emma, that's not—" Sarah began, but Emma continued. "Mom told us last year when we were doing a school project about family history. She said when she had thyroid cancer, you and Grandma Margaret helped with the medical bills so Dad didn't have to choose between treating Mom and keeping the house." Robert's eyes filled with tears. He'd forgotten that Sarah even knew about the $20,000 loan he and Margaret had insisted on giving them, the loan he'd told them to forget about when Margaret got sick. "That's different, sweetheart," Robert said quietly. "You were just babies then. Your mom had her whole life ahead of her." "So do you," Sophie said fiercely, surprising everyone with her vehemence. "You think we don't need you anymore just because we're 6'10"? You think we don't want to bring our boyfriends home to meet our grandpa? You think we don't want you to walk us down the aisle someday if our dad's too emotional to do it without crying?" Michael wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "The girls are right, Dad. We'll figure out the money. We'll take out loans, sell the house if we have to. But we're not giving up on you." Thursday brought an unexpected development. Dr. Walsh knocked on Robert's door early in the morning, accompanied by a woman in a navy blue suit who introduced herself as Dr. Angela Martinez from the National Institutes of Health. "Mr. Mitchell," Dr. Martinez said, "we've been following your case with great interest. Your condition appears to be completely unique in medical literature, and we'd like to propose something that could benefit both you and medical science." She opened a briefcase and pulled out several official-looking documents. "The NIH has a program for studying rare medical conditions. If you agree to participate in our research study, we'll cover all medical costs associated with your treatment. In addition, you'd receive compensation for your participation in the research." Robert looked suspiciously at the papers. "What kind of research? You want to experiment on me?" "Not experiment," Dr. Martinez said carefully. "Document, study, learn. Your condition could help us understand tissue growth, cellular regeneration, perhaps even develop new treatments for other patients with similar conditions." Dr. Walsh leaned forward. "Robert, what she's saying is that your case could help save other people, and the research funding would cover your surgery completely." Michael grabbed his father's hand. "Dad, this could be the answer to everything." But Robert was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the Cleveland skyline. Finally, he spoke. "If I do this research thing, other people with something like this won't have to go through what I've been through. They won't have to choose between getting help and bankrupting their families." "That's exactly right," Dr. Martinez said. "Medical knowledge advances when brave patients are willing to share their experiences." Robert thought about Margaret, about all the treatments that hadn't existed when she was diagnosed, about all the advances in cancer care that had come too late to save her. He thought about the young families who might face the same impossible choices he'd been facing. "Where do I sign?" he said. Friday morning arrived with the sterile urgency that only a teaching hospital could produce. By 6 a.m., Cleveland Medical Center's OR7 had been transformed into something resembling mission control, with monitors displaying vital signs, imaging equipment positioned at precise angles, and a surgical team that read like a medical all-star roster. Dr. Walsh had assembled specialists from 4 different departments, each bringing expertise that would be crucial for what they were calling the most complex cervical mass removal in the hospital's history. Robert had been awake since 4:30, not from anxiety, but from habit. 72 years of rising before dawn didn't disappear just because you were facing the most dangerous day of your life. He'd spent the pre-dawn hours writing letters, one to Michael, one to Sarah and the twins, and a long one to Margaret that he'd never intended anyone else to read. "You scared, Grandpa?" Emma had asked during visiting hours the evening before, her 16-year-old directness cutting through the adult pretenses that had filled the room for days. "Terrified," Robert had admitted, surprising everyone with his honesty. "But not of dying, sweetheart. I'm scared of not being there to see you girls graduate, to meet the young men you'll bring home, to watch you become the amazing women I know you're going to be." Now, as the preoperative nurses prepared him for surgery, Robert found himself thinking about the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 days ago, he'd been a forgotten widower hiding a shameful secret in a cramped apartment above a hardware store. Today, he was the center of medical attention from researchers across the country, his case being live-streamed to medical schools and teaching hospitals from Boston to Los Angeles. The anesthesiologist, Dr. James Chen, a soft-spoken man in his 50s, appeared at Robert's bedside with the practiced calm of someone who'd guided thousands of patients into medically induced sleep. "Mr. Mitchell, I want you to know that we've got the best team in the state taking care of you today. Dr. Walsh has been planning this procedure for 3 days, and everyone in that room is there specifically because they're the best at what they do." Michael stood beside the gurney, his hand gripping his father's with the desperation of a man who'd realized too late how much he'd taken for granted. "Dad, I need to say something before they take you in." Robert squeezed his son's hand. "You don't need to say anything, Michael. I know. No, I do need to say it." Michael's voice was thick with emotion he'd spent 45 years learning to suppress. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I wasn't there when Mom died. I'm sorry I let 3 years go by without really seeing you. I'm sorry you felt like you had to hide this from me." "Son, I'm not finished," Michael said, tears streaming down his face. "I want you to know that you were the best father anyone could ask for. You taught me how to solve problems, how to be honest, how to take care of the people I love. And I failed at that last part. But I'm not going to fail anymore." Robert felt his own tears coming. "You didn't fail, Michael. You became exactly the man I hoped you'd become. You've got a beautiful family, a good job, and more integrity than I ever managed. I'm proud of you, son. I've always been proud of you." As they wheeled Robert toward the operating room, he caught glimpses of the crowd that had gathered to wish him well. Mrs. Henderson had driven up from Millfield again, this time with half the town, it seemed. Former students lined the hallway, some he recognized and others who'd grown into adults he might not have known if they hadn't introduced themselves. Murphy from the hardware store stood near the nurse's station, Einstein's carrier at his feet, the cat's amber eyes watching through the mesh door. "Give 'em hell in there, Robert," Murphy called out as the gurney passed. "This town's not ready to lose its best math teacher." The operating room itself was intimidating in its technological complexity. Banks of monitors displayed real-time images of Robert's anatomy, while surgical instruments that looked more like precision engineering tools than medical equipment waited on sterile trays. The surgical team moved with choreographed efficiency, each person knowing their role in what would be a 6-hour procedure. Dr. Walsh approached Robert's bed as the anesthesia team prepared their equipment. "Robert, I want you to know something. In 15 years of practicing medicine, I've never had a case that's taught me more about courage than yours. What you're doing today, agreeing to let us document and study this procedure, is going to help patients for decades to come. Just make sure I wake up to see those granddaughters graduate high school, Robert said, managing a smile despite the oxygen mask being placed over his face. Count backward from 10 for me, Mr. Mitchell, Dr. Chen said gently. 10, 9. Margaret, I'll see you soon. 8, 7. In the observation gallery above OR7, Michael sat with Sarah and the twins, watching monitors that displayed his father's vital signs. The gallery was packed with medical students, residents, and visiting physicians from other hospitals, all there to witness what Dr. Walsh had described as a once-in-a-career case. But for Michael, the clinical fascination meant nothing compared to the terror of watching his father's life reduced to green lines on a black screen. The first 2 hours of surgery proceeded according to plan. Dr. Walsh had spent days studying the imaging, planning each incision with the precision of an architect. The mass was even larger than they'd anticipated, nearly 8 inches at its widest point, and integrated with Robert's anatomy in ways that defied medical explanation. Healthy tissue had somehow grown around and through the cyst, creating a biological puzzle that required constant decision-making. It's like his body adapted to accommodate this growth, Dr. Walsh murmured to her surgical team. Her voice transmitted to the observation gallery through the intercom system. The blood vessels have rerouted themselves. The nerve pathways have shifted. It's almost as if his anatomy reorganized itself to keep functioning despite this massive disruption. Dr. Patricia Kim, the pathologist, was taking tissue samples every few minutes, preserving specimens that would be studied in medical schools for years to come. The cellular structure is unlike anything I've seen, she reported. It's definitely sebaceous in origin, but there are formations here that don't appear in any textbook. Hour 3 brought the first complication. As Dr. Walsh worked to separate the mass from a major nerve bundle, Robert's blood pressure dropped suddenly, triggering alarms throughout the operating room. "BP's dropping fast," called out the anesthesiologist. 80/40 and falling. In the gallery, Michael gripped Sarah's hand as they watched the surgical team spring into action. Additional monitors were brought online, medications were adjusted, and for 10 terrifying minutes, Robert's condition remained unstable. "Come on, Dad," Michael whispered, his face pressed against the gallery window. "You promised to see the girls graduate. You don't get to break promises now." Dr. Walsh never paused in her work, her hands steady despite the crisis unfolding around her. "He's stabilizing," she announced after what felt like hours, but had been only minutes. "Blood pressure's coming back up. Let's continue." By hour 4, they'd successfully removed nearly 60% of the mass, revealing anatomical structures that shouldn't have existed. The cyst had developed its own network of blood vessels, its own nerve pathways, almost like a separate organ that had somehow integrated itself with Robert's existing biology. "Are you getting this?" Dr. Walsh asked the videographer who was documenting every moment of the procedure. "This is going to revolutionize how we think about tissue adaptation and cellular regeneration." Hour 5 brought another crisis, this one more serious than the first. As they worked to remove the deepest portion of the mass, Robert's heart rhythm became irregular, then stopped entirely. "We're in VFib," the cardiac monitor technician announced, and suddenly the operating room exploded into controlled chaos. "Starting CPR," one of the nurses called out as she began chest compressions. "Charge the defibrillator to 200, Dr. Chen ordered. In the gallery, Sarah had to physically restrain Michael from trying to break through the glass. Emma and Sophie sat frozen, watching their grandfather's life hang in the balance as medical professionals fought to restart his heart. "Clear!" The defibrillator discharged with a sharp crack, and Robert's body jerked on the operating table. Nothing. The monitor showed a flat line. Again, charge to 300. "Clear!" Another shock. Another moment of terrifying silence. Then, miraculously, the monitor showed a single heartbeat. Then another. Then a steady, if weak, rhythm. "We've got him back," Dr. Chen announced, and the entire gallery erupted in quiet sobs of relief. But Dr. Walsh knew they weren't finished. The most delicate part of the surgery lay ahead, removing the final portions of the mass without damaging the critical structures that kept Robert alive. "Let's finish this," she said, her voice steady despite having just watched a man die and return to life on her operating table. Mr. Mitchell didn't come this far to give up now. The 47 minutes that followed Robert Mitchell's cardiac arrest would be studied in medical schools for decades, not just for the surgical techniques employed, but for what they revealed about the mysterious boundary between life and death. In OR7, Dr. Jennifer Walsh refused to accept what every monitor, every medical protocol, and 15 years of experience told her was inevitable. Robert Mitchell was clinically dead, but she wasn't ready to let him go. "Continue chest compressions," she ordered, her voice cutting through the mechanical silence that had replaced the steady beeping of vital sign monitors. The surgical team exchanged glances. They'd been working on a dead man for 20 minutes, far beyond the point where any reasonable hope of neurological recovery remained. But something in Dr. Walsh's voice, something about Robert's story, and the courage it had taken to get him to this table, made them continue. In the observation gallery above, Michael Mitchell had collapsed into his chair, his face buried in his hands. The green lines on the monitors that had represented his father's life for the past 6 hours had gone flat, replaced by the awful continuous tone that every family member in every hospital waiting room dreaded. Sarah sat beside him, one arm around his shaking shoulders, the other holding Emma and Sophie as they cried quietly. "He was supposed to see us graduate," Sophie whispered through her tears. "He promised he'd teach us to drive. He promised he wouldn't leave us like Grandma did." Emma, typically the stronger of the twins, surprised everyone by breaking down completely. "It's not fair. We just found out how brave he was. We just started really knowing him. Grandpas aren't supposed to die when you're only 11. Down in OR7, Dr. Walsh was fighting a battle that medical science said she'd already lost. "Give me another dose of epinephrine," she called out, continuing chest compressions with mechanical precision, "and charge the defibrillator again." Dr. Chen, the anesthesiologist, approached her gently. "Jennifer, it's been 35 minutes. His brain has been without oxygen for—" "I know exactly how long it's been," Dr. Walsh interrupted, sweat beading on her forehead despite the operating room's controlled temperature. "And I know what the textbooks say about neurological viability after cardiac arrest, but this man died and came back once already during this surgery. He's fought for 2.5 years with a condition that should have killed him months ago. We don't give up on fighters." She looked around the operating room at her assembled team, some of the best medical professionals in the state, all watching her continue what appeared to be a futile effort. "I need to know that we tried everything. Absolutely everything. Because when his son asks me if we did all we could, I want the answer to be yes." The team resumed their efforts with renewed determination. More medications were administered. The defibrillator discharged again and again, sending Robert's lifeless form jerking on the operating table. CPR continued with mechanical precision, trying to force life back into a heart that had given up beating. The neurological monitors showed nothing but flat lines. At the 40-minute mark, Dr. Patricia Kim, the pathologist who'd been documenting the surgical findings, made an observation that would change everything. "Jennifer," she said quietly, studying the tissue samples she'd been preserving throughout the surgery, "I'm seeing something in these cellular structures that I've never encountered before." Dr. Walsh paused in her chest compressions, looking at her colleague. "What do you mean?" "The cyst tissue we removed. It's not just sebaceous material." There are cellular formations here that appear to have developed their own vascular network, almost like they've been supporting additional blood flow to his brain and major organs. It's as if his body adapted to this growth by creating redundant circulatory pathways. The implication hit everyone in the room simultaneously. If Robert's anatomy had somehow reorganized itself around his condition, if his body had developed alternative ways to maintain vital functions, then maybe, just maybe, the usual rules about cardiac arrest and brain death didn't apply. "Keep going," Dr. Walsh said, resuming chest compressions with renewed vigor. If his body found ways to adapt to that massive growth, maybe it found ways to protect itself that we don't understand yet. In the gallery, Mrs. Henderson had arrived sometime during the crisis, having driven from Millfield the moment she heard about the surgery. She sat with the family now, her weathered hands folded in prayer, occasionally whispering what sounded like arguments with God about the unfairness of taking good men before their time. "Robert Eugene Mitchell," she said under her breath, loudly enough for the family to hear. "You stubborn old fool, don't you dare give up now. That cat of yours is waiting for you. And someone needs to teach these girls how to parallel park without giving their parents heart attacks." At exactly 47 minutes after his heart had stopped, a span of time that would later be verified by multiple recording devices and witnesses, something extraordinary happened. A single blip appeared on the cardiac monitor, then another, then impossibly a weak but steady heartbeat resumed. The operating room fell silent except for the blessed sound of beeping monitors. Dr. Walsh stopped chest compressions and stared at the displays, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. Robert's blood pressure began to register. His oxygen saturation slowly improved. The neurological monitors, which had shown flat lines for nearly an hour, began displaying minimal but measurable brain activity. "I don't believe it," Dr. Chen whispered, checking and rechecking his equipment. "In 30 years of anesthesiology, I've never seen anything like this. He was dead, Jennifer. Clinically, completely dead for 47 minutes. Apparently," Dr. Walsh said, her voice filled with wonder, "Robert Mitchell had other plans." In the gallery, the family watched in stunned silence as the monitors came back to life. The flat green lines were replaced by the rhythmic peaks and valleys that represented heartbeat, blood pressure, brain activity, all the electronic evidence that someone they loved was still fighting, still alive, still refusing to give up. Michael raised his head from his hands, staring at the displays as if they might be malfunctioning. "Is he? Are those real?" A nurse appeared in the gallery. "His vital signs are stabilizing," she reported, her own voice filled with amazement. "Dr. Walsh says his heart rhythm is getting stronger, and they're seeing brain activity that suggests he may have avoided the neurological damage we were concerned about." Sarah burst into tears of relief, pulling her daughters close. "He's coming back to us. Your grandfather is coming back." But Dr. Walsh knew they weren't out of danger yet. Robert's return to life was miraculous, but he'd endured massive trauma, the original surgery, blood loss, and now 47 minutes of cardiac arrest. The next few days would determine whether the man who woke up would still be the Robert Mitchell his family knew and loved, or whether his incredible survival had come at the cost of the mind and personality that made him who he was. As the surgical team worked to complete the final stages of the operation and stabilize Robert's condition, Dr. Walsh found herself thinking about the letters Michael had been reading to his unconscious father. Letters to Margaret, letters full of love and loneliness and the quiet dignity of a man who'd faced his problems alone for too long. Maybe, she thought, as she watched Robert's vital signs strengthen with each passing minute, maybe some people are just too stubborn to die, too full of love and unfinished business to let go. Maybe the human spirit, when it has something important left to do, can find ways to survive that medical science doesn't understand yet. The surgery was finally completed at 4:23 p.m., nearly 8 hours after it had begun. Robert Mitchell was alive, his massive cyst completely removed, his vital signs stable but weak. The question now was what kind of life he would return to, and whether the man who'd entered the operating room that morning would still exist when he opened his eyes. As they prepared to move him to intensive care, Dr. Walsh placed a gentle hand on Robert's shoulder. "You did it, you stubborn old teacher," she whispered. "Now comes the hard part, healing." 3 days passed in the cardiac intensive care unit like a held breath that the entire Mitchell family was afraid to release. Robert lay motionless in bed 7, surrounded by the technological orchestra of modern medicine, monitors beeping in steady rhythms, ventilators whispering mechanical breaths, IV pumps delivering precise dosages of medications that kept his recovering body functioning. The massive bandages wrapped around his neck told only part of the story of what he'd survived. Michael had established a permanent vigil in the uncomfortable reclining chair beside his father's bed, leaving only for brief trips to the cafeteria when Sarah insisted he needed to eat something. The guilt that had driven him to Cleveland 3 days earlier had transformed into something deeper, a desperate need to be present for every moment of his father's recovery, as if his attention alone could will Robert back to consciousness. On the second day, Michael had driven back to Millfield to collect some of his father's personal belongings, thinking that familiar objects might somehow help call him back. Mrs. Henderson had met him at the apartment above Murphy's Hardware, her eyes red from crying as she handed him the keys. "Your father's been feeding that stray cat every morning for 2 years, she'd said, gesturing toward Einstein, who sat on the windowsill looking lost without his daily routine. "Murphy says he can keep the cat at the store, but I think Robert would want to know Einstein's being cared for." Among Robert's few possessions, Michael found the wooden box containing dozens of unsent letters to Margaret. Reading them in the hospital waiting room had been like discovering a completely different version of his father. Not the stoic, self-sufficient man he'd always known, but someone vulnerable and lonely, someone who'd been slowly disappearing into grief while his son lived his busy life 200 miles away. "Dear Maggie," one letter read in Robert's careful handwriting, "I tried to make your pot roast tonight, but I think I forgot something important because it tasted like cardboard. I miss having someone to cook for. I miss having someone to tell about my day, even though my days aren't worth much telling anymore. The thing on my neck is getting bigger. I can't hide it much longer, but I can't bear to worry Michael and Sarah and the girls. You always knew what to do, Maggie. I could use some of your wisdom right about now." Dr. Walsh visited twice daily, checking Robert's neurological responses and monitoring the gradual improvement in his vital signs. Each day brought small encouragements: stronger heart rhythms, better oxygen levels, increased brain activity on the EEG readings. But the crucial question remained unanswered. When Robert woke up, would he still be the man they'd known? "The patterns we're seeing are actually quite encouraging," Dr. Walsh told the family on the 3rd morning. "His brain activity is much more robust than we expected after such a prolonged cardiac arrest. The cellular adaptations we discovered during surgery may have provided some protection that we don't fully understand yet." Emma and Sophie had returned to Columbus to maintain some semblance of normal routine, but they called every few hours for updates. Emma, typically the more direct of the twins, had been asking increasingly difficult questions. "Will Grandpa remember us? Will he still be able to help us with math homework? Will he still want to teach us to drive?" Sarah had been making daily trips between Columbus and Cleveland, managing the twins' school schedules while supporting Michael through the vigil. On the 3rd evening, she brought dinner from the hospital cafeteria and found Michael reading aloud from one of Robert's letters to Margaret. "I remember this," Michael said, looking up at his wife. "This letter is about the Christmas when the girls were 8 and they wanted to build a snowman in our backyard. Dad helped them, and he got so cold that Mom had to make him hot chocolate with those little marshmallows he pretended not to like. He loved those marshmallows, Sarah said softly, settling into the chair beside Michael's. He just didn't want anyone to think he was getting soft in his old age. The breakthrough came at 11:47 p.m. on the third night, when Michael was dozing fitfully in his bedside chair. The change was subtle at first. A slight flutter of Robert's eyelids, barely perceptible except to someone who'd been watching for signs of consciousness for 72 hours. The monitors registered the shift immediately, showing increased brain activity and changes in heart rate that suggested emerging awareness. Michael sat up instantly, his hand reaching for his father's arm. "Dad? Dad, can you hear me?" Robert's eyes opened slowly, blinking against the harsh fluorescent lighting of the ICU. His first conscious sight was the institutional ceiling tiles above his bed. His second was his son's face, drawn with exhaustion and worry, staring at him with an expression of desperate hope. His third was the overwhelming awareness of pain in his neck and the strange sensation that something that had been part of him for years was no longer there. "Michael?" Robert's voice was barely a whisper, roughened by days of mechanical ventilation and the trauma of major surgery. "What happened? Where am I?" The sound of his father's voice, weak but undeniably coherent, nearly broke Michael's composure entirely. "You're at Cleveland Medical Center, Dad. You had surgery. A big surgery. You—" He struggled to find words that could encompass everything that had happened. "You died for a while, but you came back." Robert processed this information slowly, his brown eyes showing the methodical thinking that Michael remembered from childhood, the way his father had always worked through complex problems step by step. "Died? How long was I gone?" 47 minutes, Michael said, tears streaming down his face. "The doctors said it was impossible, but you came back anyway. You stubborn, wonderful old man, you came back to us." A smile tugged at the corners of Robert's mouth despite the pain and confusion. "Well, I guess Margaret wasn't ready for me yet. She always did say I was too stubborn to die on schedule." Dr. Walsh arrived within minutes, summoned by the night nurses who'd been monitoring Robert's miraculous recovery. She performed a series of neurological tests, checking his reflexes, his memory, his cognitive function, and found responses that seemed almost impossible given what he'd survived. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, pulling up a chair beside his bed, "do you remember why you're here? Do you remember agreeing to the surgery?" Robert's eyes found her face, and Michael was relieved to see recognition there. Not the blank stare of severe neurological damage, but the alert attention of his father's active mind. "I remember the research study. I remember thinking that if what I was going through could help other people, then it was worth it. Did it work? Did we learn something useful?" Dr. Walsh exchanged a look with Michael, both of them amazed by the clarity of Robert's thinking. "Mr. Mitchell, your case has already revolutionized how we understand complex cyst formations. We've identified cellular structures that had never been documented before. Your courage has created a treatment protocol that will help patients around the world." "And the cost?" Robert asked, his practical nature asserting itself even in his weakened state. "How much is this going to burden my family?" "Dad," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion, "the Research Foundation is covering everything, all of it, and they're paying you for participating in the study. You don't have to worry about money ever again." Robert closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing this information. When he opened them again, there were tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. "So, I'm not going to be a burden after all?" "You were never a burden, Dad. You were just too proud to let us love you the way we wanted to." Over the following days, as Robert's strength slowly returned, the family began to understand the full scope of what had happened. The NIH research team arrived with documentation showing that Robert's case had already led to successful treatment of 17 similar patients worldwide. The surgical footage had become the most requested educational video in the history of Cleveland Medical Center. Medical schools across the country were incorporating his case into their curricula. Dr. Angela Martinez returned with revised contracts and compensation agreements. The initial $50,000 research payment had been increased, with ongoing monthly payments as the study continued. More importantly, the Robert Mitchell Protocol was saving lives, preventing other families from facing the impossible choices that had nearly destroyed Robert's. "Your father," Dr. Martinez told Michael during one of her visits, "has become something of a legend in medical research circles. His willingness to participate in our study, combined with the unprecedented nature of his condition and recovery, has created a perfect storm of medical advancement." But for Robert, the most meaningful moment came when Murphy arrived with Einstein in his carrier, having convinced the hospital staff to allow a brief visit. The orange tabby cat pressed against the mesh door, purring loudly when he saw his daily caretaker, conscious and alert. "Been missing your morning feeding routine," Murphy said, his weathered face creased with relief. "This cat's been sitting by your apartment door every morning, waiting for you to come out with his breakfast." Robert reached toward the carrier with trembling fingers, and Einstein pushed his orange paw through the mesh to touch his hand. "Hey there, Einstein," Robert whispered. "Sorry to keep you waiting, old friend." The simple interaction, a man greeting the stray cat he'd been caring for, represented everything about Robert's character that the medical crisis had nearly obscured. He was a man who took responsibility seriously, who honored small commitments as faithfully as large ones, who found meaning in the daily acts of kindness that most people never noticed. As the week progressed, Robert's recovery continued to amaze his medical team. His cognitive function remained completely intact. His personality showed no changes from the neurological trauma he'd endured. Most remarkably, his attitude toward his condition and his family had undergone a fundamental shift. "I spent 3 years thinking that growth was the worst thing that could happen to me," he told Dr. Walsh during one of his final evaluations before being moved to a regular hospital room. "I thought it was going to destroy my dignity, bankrupt my family, turn me into everything I was afraid of becoming." "And now?" Dr. Walsh asked. "Now I understand that it was actually the best thing that ever happened to us. It brought my family back together. It taught me that accepting love isn't the same as being weak, and apparently it's going to help a lot of other people avoid going through what I went through." He paused, looking out the window at the Cleveland skyline where his medical journey had begun. "Margaret always said that every cloud has a silver lining. I thought she was just being overly optimistic. Turns out she was being realistic. You just have to survive long enough to see the silver." The transformation wasn't just in Robert's perspective, it was in the entire family dynamic. Michael had taken extended leave from his insurance job to be present for his father's recovery. Sarah and the twins had rearranged their lives to include regular visits and daily phone calls. The crisis had revealed not just how much they loved Robert, but how much they needed him in their lives. "I'm not going back to that apartment above Murphy's," Robert told Michael as they planned his discharge from the hospital. "But I'm not going to be a burden on your family either. I want my own space. But I want to be close enough to help with homework and driving lessons and all the grandfather duties I've been missing." Michael smiled, remembering the conversation he'd had with Sarah about converting their basement into an apartment for his father. "Actually, Dad, we've been hoping you'd consider moving to Columbus. We've got some ideas about how to make that work." For the first time in years, Robert Mitchell was looking forward to tomorrow. The stubborn, proud man who'd nearly died alone had discovered that survival was just the beginning of learning how to live. 3 months later, Robert Mitchell stood at the kitchen window of his son's Columbus home, watching November's golden light filter through maple trees that were shedding their leaves in the backyard where his granddaughters were creating architectural masterpieces from autumn's debris. The scene was so perfectly ordinary, so wonderfully normal, that he sometimes had to pause just to marvel at the simple miracle of being alive to witness it. The scar on his neck had healed into a thin white line that he no longer felt compelled to hide behind scarves and high collars. In fact, when children at the community center asked about it during his volunteer math tutoring sessions, he'd trace the surgical site with his finger and tell them, "This ugly thing saved my life and helped doctors learn how to help other people." Sometimes what looks like the worst thing that could happen turns out to be exactly what needed to happen. His basement apartment in Michael and Sarah's home had become a perfect compromise between independence and family connection. With its own entrance, small kitchenette, and comfortable living space, it allowed him to maintain the autonomy he'd always cherished while being close enough to hear Emma's violin practice and Sophie's animated phone conversations with friends. More importantly, it meant he was available for the daily moments that had been missing from their lives for too long, helping with algebra homework, listening to teenage concerns, and providing the steady presence that only grandfathers could offer. "Morning, Dad," Michael said, appearing in the kitchen doorway with damp hair from his shower. The transformation in their relationship over the past months had been as remarkable as Robert's medical recovery. What had begun as guilt-driven attention had evolved into genuine friendship between two men who'd finally learned to see each other clearly, without the barriers of pride and assumption that had kept them distant for years. "Morning, son. Coffee's ready, and Sarah's got that apple pie in the oven that's making the whole house smell like your mother's kitchen used to." Robert poured 2 mugs, adding cream to Michael's with the precision of someone who'd finally learned the details of daily care that love required. The kitchen had become their morning meeting place, where father and son shared news from the previous day and planned for the day ahead. It was a ritual that neither had experienced since Michael's childhood, and both treasured it with the awareness of people who understood how easily such moments could be lost. Outside the window, Emma and Sophie were engaged in serious architectural discussions about the proper engineering principles for leaf pile construction. At 11 years old, they'd developed distinctly different approaches to most activities, Emma favoring bold, experimental designs while Sophie preferred careful, methodical planning. But they worked together with the seamless cooperation that only twins could achieve. "You know," Michael said, accepting his coffee and settling into the comfortable rhythm of their morning conversation, "I got another call yesterday from that documentary producer, the one Dr. Walsh mentioned a few weeks ago." Robert grimaced slightly, still uncomfortable with the attention his medical case had generated. "What do they want now? I've already done more interviews than a man should have to do in one lifetime." "They want to feature your story in a medical documentary series." Apparently, the surgical footage has become required viewing in medical schools across the country, and they want to add the family perspective, show how medical crises affect entire families, not just patients. The sliding door burst open with the dramatic flair that only Emma could manage, leaves still clinging to her jacket and hair. "Grandpa, Mom says they want to put you on television." "Maybe," Robert said cautiously, remembering his lifelong preference for privacy. "But I'm not sure an old math teacher belongs on television talking about his medical problems." Sophie appeared behind her sister, her more reserved nature evident in the way she hung back near the door until Robert gestured for her to come closer. "Are you kidding, Grandpa? You're like the coolest grandfather anyone could have. You literally came back from the dead." "That's superhero stuff," Robert laughed, remembering when his biggest concern had been affording his monthly medications and hiding his condition from his family. The research payments from the National Institutes of Health had eliminated his financial worries completely, not just the substantial initial compensation, but ongoing monthly payments, as researchers continued studying his case and developing the treatment protocol that bore his name. More significantly, he'd discovered a sense of purpose he'd never expected to find at 72. The Robert Mitchell protocol had been successfully applied to 43 patients worldwide, including a 38-year-old teacher in Portland whose case had been deemed inoperable until surgeons reviewed his operative footage. The knowledge that his suffering had prevented others from facing the same impossible choices gave profound meaning to everything he'd endured. "Girls," Sarah called from the doorway, flour dusting her apron from the morning's baking project, "come help me set the table. We've got company coming for Sunday dinner." Robert raised an eyebrow at his son. "Company? You didn't mention we were having guests." Michael grinned with the satisfaction of someone planning a pleasant surprise. "Dr. Walsh and her daughter Katie. She's been wanting to meet the family of her most famous patient, and her 12-year-old apparently has some questions about the surgery for a school project about medical heroes." The afternoon that followed was filled with the kind of warmth that Robert had thought he'd lost forever when Margaret died. Dr. Walsh arrived with Katie, a bright-eyed girl who reminded Robert of his granddaughters at that age, curious, articulate, and completely unintimidated by adult conversation. "Mr. Mitchell," Katie said over Sarah's carefully prepared dinner, her voice carrying the serious tone of someone conducting important research. "My mom says you weren't scared during the surgery because you were unconscious, but were you scared before?" Robert considered the question with the thoughtfulness that had made him an effective teacher. "Terrified," he admitted honestly. "But not of dying, sweetheart. I was scared of not getting to see your mom's beautiful surgical work heal properly, of not getting to watch these girls grow up, of leaving my son with regrets about all the conversations we should have had but never did." "But you did get to see all those things," Katie pointed out with 12-year-old logic. "Yes, I did. And that's exactly why every single day feels like a gift now. Every morning when I wake up and hear Emma practicing violin or Sophie laughing on the phone, every evening when Michael and I have coffee and talk about things that matter, all of it feels precious in ways I never appreciated before." Dr. Walsh smiled across the dinner table, her professional satisfaction evident. "Robert, I wanted to tell you something that might interest you. The Medical Research Foundation has decided to establish an educational scholarship in your name. The Robert Mitchell Courage in Medicine Scholarship will help medical students who want to specialize in treating rare and complex conditions. Your case has inspired an entire generation of young doctors to take on the cases that others might consider hopeless." Robert felt the familiar tightness in his throat that had become common since his surgery, as if surviving death had somehow made him more emotionally available to life's beautiful moments. "I honestly don't know what to say to something like that." "Say you'll consider doing that documentary," Emma interjected from across the table, her directness cutting through adult diplomatic language. "People need to hear your story, Grandpa. They need to know that you don't have to face scary things alone, and that sometimes what seems like the end is actually the beginning." That evening, after Dr. Walsh and Katie had returned home and the dinner dishes were cleaned and stored away, Robert sat in the family room with Michael and Sarah, watching the twins complete homework assignments at the dining room table. The scene was so perfectly ordinary, so blessedly normal, that he found himself thinking about Margaret, and how much he would have loved witnessing this second chapter of their family's story. "I've been thinking," Robert said quietly, "about that documentary idea and all the speaking requests I've been getting from hospitals and medical schools." Michael looked up from the insurance files he'd been reviewing. "Yeah? What's your conclusion?" "Maybe Emma's right. Maybe people do need to hear about what we went through. Not just the medical aspects, but the family dynamics. The way pride and fear can keep us from taking care of each other properly." Sarah set down her book, giving Robert her full attention. "What are you thinking specifically?" "I'm thinking that if our story can help one family communicate better, can encourage one person to seek medical attention instead of suffering in silence can help one stubborn old man realize that accepting help isn't the same as being a burden, then maybe it's worth whatever embarrassment comes with being on television. Michael reached over and squeezed his father's shoulder, the gesture carrying years of unspoken apology and gratitude. "Mom would be incredibly proud of you, Dad. She always said you had more wisdom than you gave yourself credit for." "Your mother," Robert said, his voice warm with memory, "always was smarter than both of us combined. She probably would have marched me to the doctor the first week that thing appeared on my neck." Over the following weeks, Robert found himself saying yes to opportunities he would have automatically refused just months earlier. The documentary interview, filmed in the comfortable setting of the family's living room with Emma and Sophie, positioned proudly on either side of their grandfather's chair. A keynote speech at Cleveland Medical Center's annual conference, where he addressed an auditorium full of doctors and medical students about the patient's perspective on rare medical conditions. A newspaper interview that resulted in dozens of letters from elderly patients who'd been inspired to seek treatment for conditions they'd been hiding from their families. Most surprisingly, he'd agreed to participate in a comprehensive medical education video that would be distributed to hospitals worldwide. The production would show not just the surgical procedure itself, but the family dynamics that had led to his delayed diagnosis, emphasizing the critical importance of regular medical care for elderly patients and the need for families to maintain honest communication about health concerns. "You know what the strangest part of this whole experience has been?" Robert told Dr. Walsh during one of his monthly follow-up appointments, which had become as much social visits as medical evaluations. "For 2.5 years, I convinced myself that growth was the worst possible thing that could happen to me. I thought it was going to destroy my family financially, burden my son with impossible choices, and steal whatever dignity I had left." "And your perspective now?" Dr. Walsh asked, reviewing his latest test results with continued amazement at his complete recovery. "Now I understand that it was actually the best thing that could have happened to all of us. It brought my family back together in ways we'd never been close before. It taught me that accepting love and help isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of wisdom. And it gave my life a purpose and meaning that I never expected to find at 72 years old." He paused, looking out the office window at the Cleveland skyline where his journey had begun in crisis and transformed into something resembling a miracle. "Margaret used to say that every cloud has a silver lining, but I always thought she was just being unrealistically optimistic. Now I understand she was being completely realistic. Sometimes you just have to survive long enough to see where the silver was hiding." As Robert left the medical center that day, walking confidently through corridors where he'd once been wheeled unconscious and dying, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this moment. The frightened, lonely widower who'd hidden his condition for years had been replaced by a man who'd found deep purpose in sharing his story, unexpected strength in accepting help, and profound joy in the simple miracle of being alive to love and be loved by his family. The documentary would air in 2 weeks, carrying his story to national audiences. Medical students would continue studying his case for decades. The scholarship fund would help future doctors learn to treat complex conditions with both medical expertise and human compassion. But none of those achievements mattered as much as the simple fact that he'd be home in time to help Emma and Sophie with their algebra homework, to share evening coffee with Michael and Sarah, and to continue his daily conversations with Margaret's photograph about how unexpectedly beautiful life could become when you finally stopped being afraid of truly living it. At 67, Robert Mitchell believed his story was over, widowed, broke, hiding a shameful secret that was literally eating him alive. Sound achingly familiar? How many of us have whispered those same defeating thoughts? "I'm too old to matter, too proud to burden my children, too ashamed to admit I need help." Robert's transformation from a forgotten man in a cramped apartment to a medical hero who saved thousands proves something profound about second acts in American life. His disgraceful growth became the Robert Mitchell Protocol, revolutionizing treatment worldwide. His financial ruin led to research compensation that secured his golden years. His near-death experience brought his family closer than they'd ever been. The stubborn grandfather who almost died alone now teaches algebra to neighborhood kids, leads hospital support groups, and shows his granddaughters that wisdom comes from surviving, not just existing. At 67, he discovered that accepting love isn't weakness, it's courage. His basement apartment in Columbus, morning coffee with his son, homework help for Emma and Sophie, these ordinary moments became extraordinary because he finally understood that being needed isn't being a burden. Your story isn't over either. Sometimes our darkest chapters become the foundation for our most meaningful endings. What shameful secret might actually be your family's greatest gift if you shared it? Have you been protecting loved ones from worries that could actually bring you closer together? Share your thoughts below. Your courage matters more than you know.